Imagine you are a 7-year-old girl, playing in the sun-drenched fields of your Circassian village in the Caucasus. The world is a place of familiar comforts. The scent of wildflowers carried on the mountain breeze, the distant sound of your mother's laughter, the profound warmth of a home you believe is an unshakable fortress. Then, a shadow falls over your world. Raiders, their faces hardened by a brutal, lucrative trade, storm into your life. They are not here for gold or tribute. They are here for you. Your screams are swallowed by the chaos as you are torn from your family's desperate grasp. The pale faces of your parents, contorted in a mask of helpless, primal terror, will be the last image of home seared into your memory. You are now a piece of merchandise. Your future, a terrifying, formless unknown. You will never see your family again. The Ottoman Empire, a civilization that controlled the fate of millions across 3 continents for over 6 centuries, is remembered for its magnificent architecture, its powerful, enigmatic sultans, and its strategic conquests. But behind the golden facades of the Topkapi Palace and the glorious narratives of empire lay a series of systematic practices so disturbing, so methodically cruel, that even contemporary observers struggled to document them. These were not isolated incidents of depravity or simple cultural misunderstandings. They were institutional policies that transformed human beings into commodities, reducing women and girls to objects in a marketplace of flesh that operated with the chilling efficiency of a modern corporation. What you are about to discover comes from the empire's own meticulous administrative records, from the horrified eyewitness accounts of foreign diplomats and travelers, and from archaeological evidence revealing how an empire weaponized its most vulnerable members. The practices we will explore were not aberrations. They were fundamental pillars of imperial governance that shaped the lives of countless women across centuries. The most chilling aspect is not just what happened, but how methodically it was all organized, legally sanctioned, and woven into the very fabric of the economy and society. Let us begin with the sheer scale of this human tragedy. In Constantinople, the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire, it is estimated that during the 16th and 17th centuries, approximately 1/5 of the entire population consisted of slaves. But here is what makes this statistic particularly horrifying: the vast majority of these slaves were women and girls. Every substantial household, from the grandest vizier to the moderately wealthy merchant, owned female slaves. We are not talking about a small, hidden trade. This was an entire economic system, a foundational pillar of the imperial economy built on the systematic exploitation of women. The empire operated specialized markets dedicated entirely to the sale of female slaves. The Avret Pazari, or female slave bazaar in Istanbul, functioned openly from the mid-15th century to the early 20th century. Think about that timeline for a moment. This was not some ancient practice that disappeared with medieval times. This market was operating when America was fighting its civil war, when Europe was experiencing the Industrial Revolution. While the world was supposedly becoming more civilized, the Ottoman state did not just tolerate this trade, they regulated it. They taxed every transaction and created elaborate legal frameworks to govern the ownership and use of human beings. Officials maintained meticulous records of purchases, prices, and the racial classifications that determined a woman's market value. The bureaucracy of human trafficking was as sophisticated as any other aspect of imperial administration. The methods of acquisition reveal the true scope of this systematic horror. Women and girls were captured through organized military campaigns specifically designed for human procurement. The main sources included the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Africa. But calling them sources sanitizes the reality. These were coordinated raids on civilian populations where sexual violence was not an unfortunate byproduct of war, but a deliberate and calculated prelude to enslavement. During major conquests, the pattern was always the same. Contemporary accounts describe how Ottoman troops would systematically assault women before enslaving them. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 provides a glimpse into this horror. The historian George Francis documented how people of both genders were violated inside the Hagia Sophia itself. The holiest sanctuary of Eastern Christendom was turned into a stage for brutal conquest. Monasteries were specifically targeted, with nuns being led to ships where they were assaulted by Ottoman troops before being sold at auction throughout the empire. This psychological warfare was intentional. Some women chose death over enslavement, casting themselves into wells or taking their own lives rather than face what awaited them. But most had no choice. Children were torn from their mothers, their cries echoing in villages that would be left scarred for generations. Young women were brutalized to death, their bodies left on highways as terrifying warnings to other communities about the cost of resistance. Once captured, the empire created elaborate racial hierarchies that determined a woman's fate and market value. While officially claiming no racial distinctions existed among slaves, the reality was starkly different. White women, particularly Circassians renowned for their beauty, commanded the highest status and prices. They were followed by those from Ethiopia, with black African women relegated to the lowest tier. This was not simply about preference. It was a systematic classification that determined everything from living conditions to the type of exploitation a woman would face. The pricing structure reveals the calculated nature of this dehumanization. African slave girls purchased for both domestic work and sexual use typically sold for between 1,500 and 2,500 kurush. White slave girls commanded 3,000 kurush if intended for domestic service, but prices soared above 6,000 kurush for those designated as concubines. In documented cases, some women sold for as much as 88,000 kurush, equivalent to massive fortunes. The empire had created a detailed catalogue of human beings based on their perceived sexual and domestic utility. The merchants who facilitated this trade operated within a sophisticated professional hierarchy. Those dealing in white slaves enjoyed higher social status, joined prestigious merchant guilds, and catered to wealthy clients. The system incentivized specialization in human trafficking by rewarding those who dealt in the most valuable human commodities. But the true horror lay in what happened after the purchase. Female slaves existed in a legal vacuum where sexual exploitation was not a crime, but a right of ownership. A Muslim man was legally permitted to have sexual relations with any female slave he owned, though not with slaves owned by his wife. This created a bizarre legal distinction that treated women as sexual property to be shared or withheld based on ownership arrangements. The children born from these forced relationships were considered legitimate if acknowledged by their owners. This policy, far from being a humane consideration, actively encouraged systematic rape by providing legal and social benefits to the perpetrators. Women had no control over their own bodies, their reproductive choices, or the fate of their children. They could be transformed from household servants to prostitutes at their owner's whim, sold for temporary sexual use, or publicly displayed naked in slave markets for customer inspection. The legal framework supporting this system was comprehensive and deliberate. Religious scholars issued fatwas stating that under certain circumstances, slave owners could kill their slaves without fear of punishment in the afterlife. This wasn't theoretical theology, it was practical guidance for a society that had completely normalized the ownership and disposal of human beings. The case of Circassian women illustrates how international events could fuel this systematic exploitation. Following the Russian expulsion of Circassians from the 1850s onward, thousands of women seeking refuge with the Ottomans instead found themselves enslaved. The scale reached such proportions that British observers noted that white human flesh had never been cheaper, with women who once commanded £100 now selling for as little as $5. These were not random victims of circumstance. They were part of a calculated system that turned human desperation into imperial profit, transforming refugees into commodities for the sexual gratification of Ottoman elites. Within the sprawling harems of the Ottoman Empire, a nightmare masqueraded as luxury. Behind walls decorated with precious stones and silk tapestries, thousands of women lived in conditions that would horrify modern audiences. The popular image of harems as lavish spaces filled with pampered concubines bears no resemblance to the documented reality. The imperial harem alone housed between 100 and over 1,000 women at any given time. But what the romanticized stories never mention is that the vast majority of these women would never even see the sultan. They existed as human furniture, maintaining the daily operations of a system designed to service the sexual appetites of a single man. The living conditions were deliberately harsh. Rooms were cramped, unsanitary, and designed to break the spirit. Women were forbidden to leave the harem under any circumstances. Male visitors, except for the head of household, were banned. This created a prison disguised as a palace where women spent their entire lives in enforced isolation. The hierarchy within these walls was brutal and unforgiving. New arrivals, often girls as young as 6 or 7, were immediately stripped of their identities. They received new names, new religions, and new purposes determined entirely by their owners. Those deemed exceptionally beautiful faced specialized training. They learned to belly dance, recite poetry, play musical instruments, and master what Ottoman documents euphemistically called the erotic arts. But this was not education. It was systematic conditioning designed to transform traumatized children into polished instruments of male pleasure. The girls practiced these skills under the supervision of older slave women who had survived the same process, creating an endless cycle where victims became accomplices in their own oppression. The daily routine within harems reveals the psychological torture embedded in every aspect of these women's lives. They were required to maintain constant readiness for sexual service while competing desperately with hundreds of other women for the attention that might elevate their status. This competition was deliberately fostered. Women were pitted against each other in elaborate displays meant to entertain their masters while destroying any possibility of solidarity. The most heartbreaking aspect was how the system corrupted natural human relationships. Women who might have formed friendships were forced to view each other as obstacles to survival. They had to watch their companions be selected for sexual use while knowing their own turn would come. Some were chosen to participate in group encounters, forced to assist in each other's exploitation while maintaining facades of willing participation. Those who failed to please or who aged beyond their perceived usefulness faced fates that were often worse than death. They might be sold to brothels, abandoned on the streets, or simply killed to make room for younger replacements. The empire maintained no support system for women who had spent their youth serving imperial pleasure. They were disposable commodities with expiration dates determined by male desire. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the harems. Women who managed to gain freedom carried invisible scars that shaped their remaining lives. They struggled to form healthy relationships, trust other human beings, or believe in their own worth beyond their sexual utility. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe trauma disorders, becoming living ghosts who had learned to survive by completely disconnecting from their own humanity. The empire's legal codes provided elaborate protections for free Muslim women while simultaneously creating detailed regulations for the exploitation of enslaved ones. A free woman who was sexually assaulted could seek justice. But enslaved women existed outside this legal framework entirely. This dual system was not an oversight. It was carefully designed to reinforce social hierarchies through sexual control. By protecting some women while abandoning others, the empire created a stark demonstration of the value of freedom and the consequences of enslavement. Free women understood that their protected status depended on maintaining the system that brutalized their enslaved sisters. The religious justification for these practices reveals how completely the empire had corrupted spiritual teachings to serve temporal power. Islamic scholars produced detailed treatises explaining how the sexual use of enslaved women served divine purposes. They argued that enslaving infidel women was a religious duty, that using their bodies was a reward for the faithful, and that resistance to these practices constituted rebellion against God himself. This theological framework was not merely academic. It shaped the daily reality of millions. Religious authorities blessed slave markets, sanctified sexual exploitation, and provided spiritual cover for systematic brutalization. They created a parallel moral universe where rape became righteousness and slavery became salvation. The trafficking networks that fed these markets operated with a precision that would make modern criminal organizations envious. These were not opportunistic raiders. They were sophisticated procurement systems designed to harvest specific types of women for predetermined purposes. The Crimean Tatars perfected the art of human hunting, conducting annual raids into Polish, Russian, and Ukrainian territories. They called it the harvest season, timing their attacks to coincide with agricultural cycles when men would be working distant fields, leaving women and children vulnerable. The raiders moved with military precision, separating captives by age, appearance, and perceived value. Young girls between 10 and 15 commanded premium prices because they could be trained from childhood to accept their fate. Women in their 20s were valued for immediate sexual use. Those over 30 faced the harshest treatment, often worked to death or sold to brothels where their survival was measured in months. The journey to market became its own form of torture. Women were chained together in long lines called corfles, forced to walk hundreds of miles. Those who collapsed were abandoned to die. Those who resisted were beaten unconscious. Pregnant women who gave birth during the march saw their infants killed immediately, their bodies left for scavengers while the mothers were forced to continue walking. The psychological conditioning began during transport. Captives were deliberately separated from family and forbidden to use their native tongues. By the time they reached Ottoman markets, many had retreated so deeply into psychological shock that they appeared docile to potential buyers. The markets themselves were theaters of systematic dehumanization. Women were stripped naked and examined like livestock. Their bodies probed and inspected by strangers who discussed their sexual potential in clinical terms. Buyers checked teeth for age and examined breasts for fertility signs. Virginity examinations were conducted publicly, with medical officials certifying intact hymens to justify higher prices. The Ottoman state taxed every aspect of these transactions, from market stalls to ownership transfers. The bureaucracy of human trafficking generated substantial revenue for imperial coffers while creating paper trails that documented centuries of systematic exploitation. The transition from free human being to sexual property happened with an efficiency that reduced women to inventory items in household ledgers. New owners received official documentation listing their human acquisitions alongside furniture and livestock, including detailed descriptions of each woman's physical attributes and intended use. The Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1922, but its legacy of systematic exploitation echoes through generations. These were not ancient barbarities from a forgotten world. They were institutional policies that shaped 3 continents and influenced millions of lives. The archives remain, the evidence survives, and the stories demand to be remembered. History's darkest chapters teach us that civilization's facade can conceal humanity's greatest failures.